Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm Chris Sleet, Map Curator here at the library, and here this evening to talk about the Blaeu Atlas of Scotland. Just before we begin, a reminder, if you have a phone with you, to put it into silent mode. So in 1654, Scotland became one of the best mapped countries in the world. The Blaeu Atlas of Scotland featured 49 stunning hand-coloured maps of Scotland. I'll just reverse a moment. The Blaeu Atlas of Scotland featured 49 hand-coloured maps of Scotland, which showed the whole country in unprecedented detail. For most of these places, this was the first time they had ever appeared on a printed map. As Blaeu, their publisher, wrote in his greetings to the reader, "Continue now, look at Scotland, and enjoy a feast for the eyes." For contemporary readers, the maps were striking indeed. Never before had their country been laid out for viewing like this. With such an atlas, travel and seeing firsthand was no longer always necessary. Maps are all around us now, so commonplace, but then were relatively unfamiliar objects of status and wonder. And here, in maps before them, lay a visual prospect of the nation. But we're not here this evening just to delight in the wonder of the finished atlas, but rather to delve into the many stories and questions behind it. Why did it take so long to get it published? Why was Scotland's first atlas published in Amsterdam? Why was most of the content, in fact, written texts rather than maps? And in order to answer these and other questions, we need to look at many intertwined lives of surveyors, antiquarians, ministers, statesmen, printers and publishers, who sometimes seem to work as much against one another rather than with one another over half a century. So we'll tackle these questions through a largely chronological story, by first looking at Timothy Pont and the source mapping, as well as his background and context. Why did Pont fail to get his maps published in Scotland? Who rescued them, making contact with publishers in the Low Countries? We look at the role of church ministers and new mapping by James Gordon, and then the final push to publication in the 1640s. We'll look at the glory of the finished result and its value for national and regional description, before finishing up by looking at Blaeu himself, his greater ambitions, and his tragic downfall. So 40 of the 49 maps inside the atlas are the work of Timothy Pont, and so we need to start our story with him. Timothy is really a hero of Scottish map making. He was the first person to record the landscape, possibly of all of Scotland, in unprecedented detail. Before Pont, standard maps of Scotland were not based on an original survey and showed at best around 120 place names, and the geography crumpled and distorted. But through Pont's work, over 20,000 place names were recorded, and Pont included a wealth of other information too. Pont's maps illustrate what's sometimes been called a landscape of power. Large castles, tower houses, and boroughs are drawn as pictures, allowing us to visualize them clearly and see them within a political hierarchy of settlements and dwellings. On some maps, we can read the names of the owners of some of the larger properties. We can see Moncur of that ilk, or Monaghan of that ilk, and other names as well. Pont was also interested in drawing and naming many natural features in the landscape. Mountains, like we see here, looking at the mountains east of Mount Keene from Deeside. Ponce maps are also our earliest graphic record of the extent of woodland cover in Scotland in the late 16th century, confirming the trend which gathered pace at this time for the gentry to enclose and plant woodland around some of the larger castles, as we see here for Darnaway Castle near Forres. Ponce was a student at St Leonard's College in St Andrews from 1580 to 1583. St Leonard's is in fact named just to the lower left of the cathedral. And we can surmise that in his years at St Andrews, he would have come into contact with William Wellwood, professor of St Salvator's College, who taught arithmetic, geometry, geography, astronomy, and significantly, the making of charts. He might also have come into contact with John Geddy, also based at St Andrews and credited with drawing the fine bird's eye view we see here. We know that in 1592, John Lindsay, who was master of the mines in Scotland, appointed Timothy to undertake a survey of metals and minerals in Orkney and Shetland, and it's thought that he may have drafted his maps of the Northern Isles then. But Ponce's work, magnificent and awesome as it was, failed in a crucial respect of getting the maps printed and published in Ponce's time. By the early 1600s, things started to unravel fast for Timothy. Much of his work had been supported by his father, Robert Ponce. Now, Robert was a learned, respected clergyman. He was a friend to John Knox, moderator of the General Assembly of the Church on 5 separate occasions. And he was also a trusted advisor to King James VI, who we know also supported Timothy's work. But in 1603, King James headed south to become King of Great Britain and Ireland, and his interest in Scotland was rapidly superseded by his new larger British state. This was put into map form by the English map maker John Speed in his Atlas of 1611-12, entitled The Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain. And then in 1606, Timothy's father, Robert, passed away, and with it, his connections and political clout. The obvious end of Timothy's immense labours was a published atlas, but he knew well that the costs of publishing one were formidable, and the market for them was small. And it's worth reminding ourselves too of how much work and expertise just creating a printed map involved before the 20th century, illustrated by this 18th century French view of a printer's workshop. The standard workflow involved transferring the map drawing onto a prepared copper plate surface through transfer paper so that the entire map image appeared back to front in reverse. Various types of burin that we can see here to the lower left, as well as stamps were used on the copper. The engraving process could take anything from a few weeks to a few months, and when complete, allowed the copper plate to be inked up. The surface ink was then wiped from the plate, and the plate was then passed through a printing press under pressure with a sheet of moistened paper on top to squash the grooves in the copper onto the paper. The output was a black and white printed map, which was sometimes sold in this form, but often was hand-coloured, usually by boys or women until the 19th century. And that was the end of just printing one map. Now, if you want to do this for 50 maps or so, and print them with text on the back and other pages, then bind them together to create an atlas, it's a huge upfront investment before you see any returns in terms of sales. And in 1610, Timothy managed to get just one of his maps engraved, a map of Lothian and Linlithgow, by the firm of Hondius in Amsterdam, who we'll meet again soon. As the note, if we enlarge it by the title page, makes clear, Hondius had engraved it, as we see Caelavid here, sumptibus, at the expense of Andrew Hart. And Andrew Hart at this time was Scotland's wealthiest printer. But it was the only map Pont managed to get engraved in his lifetime. We know that Timothy tried unsuccessfully to secure new lands that were being settled by Scots in Ulster in 1609, suggesting he was looking for new opportunities outside of Scotland. In 1611, he was in Edinburgh, but we don't know for how long he had been there, nor how long he stayed. By 1615, Timothy Pont had died. His wife Isabel, in that year, is recorded as a widow. And publishing maps was clearly not something she was able to do. By the 1620s, Timothy's maps were reported as being worm and moth-eaten, becoming illegible even to careful eyes. The results of Timothy's heroic labours were literally fading away. So it took others to bring Pont's work to print, and as they did so, they added to Pont's work in the process. But before we look at how this happened, we need to set the scene a little further by looking at Pont's purposes, which were much broader than map making. These influenced what he did, as well as the final form of the Blaeu Atlas. What Pont gives us is not a geographic or topographic survey underpinned by a concern for geodetic accuracy, but rather an essentially qualitative, even impressionistic account in text and image of the nature of the region. And contemporaries knew this as chorography. Pont, in fact, recorded extensive written notes about his surveys, which were partly sets of distances and directions, but also chorographic accounts of regions, which landed families were where mines and forests lay, where towns were located, what the produce of a region was, and so on. And chorography was the most widely practiced form of geographical inquiry at this time. In England, France, Germany, and Italy, geographers and map makers wrote and practiced chorography. Unlike cosmography, which dealt with the earth in relation to other heavenly bodies, and geography, which dealt with the description of the whole earth, chorography aimed at the delineation in maps and texts of local areas, parts of the globe. Chorography, as understood and practiced in the late 16th and 17th century, drew upon the work of the classical geographer Claudius Ptolemy. In Book 1 of his Geographica, Ptolemy distinguished between geography and chorography. The purpose of geography is to represent the unity and continuity of the known world in its true nature and location. The aim of chorography is to represent only a part. Chorography was essentially concerned with the qualities and characters of places and areas, as we can read here for the Blaeu Atlas map and text for the Lothians. It was not concerned with their accurate location or measurement. And Timothy would certainly have been strongly influenced too by the major British chorographical work of Camden's Britannia. William Camden was a 35-year-old Oxford-educated schoolmaster when he published Britannia in 1586. The work was hugely successful. Later and revised editions appeared throughout Camden's lifetime and long after. Camden's Britannia draws on others' works. In Britain, he knew of John Leyland's chorographical work from the 1530s and William Lambarde's Perambulation of Kent from the 1570s, the first county history. But Camden also undertook his own perambulations throughout England. Now, there was no radical agenda here. It was very much supportive of the existing social order and assumed the continued authority of the monarchy and the nobility. And that fact in turn is why chorographical writing often lauds the leading families and prominent individuals of note. Patronage, patriotism, and the political well-being of the realm, revealed through its regional portrayal, were also closely associated elements, as we'll see in Blaeu's atlas. These atlases allowed armchair travel for their readers, so they could visualize faraway places through maps and texts, really much narrower objectives from all the purposes that modern-day atlases have. And another important influence on Timothy and his successors was the rise of world atlas publishing in the Low Countries. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius, pictured here, published as a single folio volume his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, a comprehensive collection of maps of the world's countries. And with the publication of this, the idea of the modern atlas as a bound collection of maps at a uniform size was born. His friend and fellow mapmaker, Gerard Mercator, followed suit in 1595 with an even more respected and influential world atlas. Following Mercator's death, his relatives auctioned his map plates, and these were acquired in 1604 by Jodocus Hondius. And this was a major publishing coup for Hondius. He soon published an expanded world atlas boasting 143 maps with the new Mercator plates, and it was highly popular. It went through 7 editions in only 6 years. And Hondius even included a plate showing Mercator on the left and he on the right, happily working together on a pair of globes, even though by this time Mercator had been dead nearly 20 years. The Hondius atlases continue to grow in size, in stature, and in popularity. The family also married into a related map-making family, Jansonius, and exploited something of a monopoly position. Very few other publishers could possibly finance an engraving and printing so many maps for a single publication when the market leader enjoyed such status and respect. But this is exactly what the publisher, Willem Blaeu, and his son, Jan, tried to do. And because they did, it had important implications for getting Timothy Pont's maps into print. In the 1630s, Willem Blaeu produced an appendix to his atlas. In 1634, published the first volume of his own intended world atlas entitled Theatrum Orbis Terrarum Sivi Atlas Novus. And this new atlas, this Atlas Novus, was the endeavour to which his son Jan was contributing in his 1654 Atlas of Scotland. Now the Hondius family hit back with their own larger atlas, initiating a battle with each publisher trying to outdo their rival by bringing out ever larger atlases. To fuel his new battle, Blaeu urgently needed new maps from new countries, and this is when his attentions turned to Scotland. Jan, or Johann Blaeu, his name was often written in Latin as Joan, was brought up in Amsterdam at a time when the city was emerging as the main centre in the world for map production. This was the golden age of the Dutch Republic, when it enjoyed a major economic, cultural, and artistic boom. Helped by the growth of its overseas empire, its domination of seaborne trade, and continued technological innovation, Dutch economic, political, and intellectual life flourished. Jan not only inherited a thriving printing and map publishing company from his father, but he also inherited the title of chief cartographer to the Dutch East India Company. This highly lucrative position also brought Blaeu into direct contact with the very latest geographic discoveries from around the world. Now, according to Robert Gordon, who we'll meet properly soon, Timothy was, quote, defeated by the avarice of printers and booksellers. In 1606, in Edinburgh, the Edinburgh printer, Thomas Finlayson, acquired a 25-year license under the Privy Seal to print and import all maps and charts. And there were also less official agreements. In January 1607, Andrew Hart, who we met earlier, entered into a contract with two other printers, Richard Lawson and James Catkin, not to print no matter of books, maps, charts, or other works without the mutual consent and common advice of us all three together. Hart was actually one of the few printers in Scotland with the resources to attempt publication of an atlas of Ponce maps, but he didn't do so, and it may be that the copyright granted to Finlayson eclipsed his own private contract. The expiry of Finlayson's copyright in 1628 certainly seems to coincide with a new phase of interest in their publication. A letter from Charles I to Sir William Alexander, who was then Secretary of State in 1629, shows that Sir James Balfour of Denmiln had acquired the maps from Ponce in or shortly before 1628. And the same letter also notes James VI's unrealised intention to have money given to Pont and orders the payment of, in fact, £100 to Balfour in order to get the maps published. Now, Sir James Balfour may have briefly entertained thoughts of publishing maps, and he did compile various topographical descriptions based on Ponce's work. But by June 1631, we know that he had passed at least some of the maps on to Sir John Scott of Scots. I'm afraid there are no surviving portraits of Sir John Scott, and so I've shown instead his family seat just a few miles south of Cupar in Fife. And Sir John Scott was a very important figure in our story in the publication of the Blaeu Atlas. He held important political posts as Director of Chancery, Lord of Session, and Privy Councillor. And through these, having the right contacts and influence in Scotland and the Low Countries. From the mid-1620s, Scott had been in correspondence with Willem Blaeu about the publication of a volume of Latin poetry. And a recent discovery, in fact in 2020, has also confirmed that Scott definitely came into possession of some of the Pont material by the mid-1620s, before Balfour. But the discovery in 1967 of 15 letters from the Blaus to Scott between 1626 and 1657, which are held here in the National Library, provide vital information on the intermittent progress with the Blaeu Atlas. Scott passed some of the Pont maps straight onto the Blaeu publishers in Amsterdam, who responded with glowing thanks. And this is one of those letters from Blaeu, as we see directed, addressed to Scott at the top. And he writes, "Your letter, with that of Master Balfour attached, and the map of the Merse, which I have received, place it beyond my power to express how much you will have put posterity in your debt here and elsewhere, when, as I intend, I shall have put the work into more finished form with your help." Now, over the next decade, Blaeu completed the engraving of about 35 or 36 Pont maps of Scottish regions. But the maps forwarded by Scott were working drafts, sometimes illegible, or sometimes with missing or duplicated sections. For example, in Pont's map of Angus, we can read the word in the centre, subtrahend, literally take away. And when we look more closely, we see duplicated names for the same place. You can see Brichty, I think I've just jumped a few slides further on. Please bear with me. There we are, I'm sorry. We can see on the left-hand side here the name of Brichty, which is replicated. And if we move a little further over to the right, the names underlined in blue and yellow are also replicated, a result of Pont's working method, where he proceeded up river valleys from different directions and needed to mesh these together to form a comprehensive map. And sometime before 1636, Blaeu passed back to Scotland those original Pomp maps and written descriptions which he required further assistance for, including ones like this. And then, in a letter of 1642, he sent a list of specific areas, which I've enlarged on screen, for which more complete maps were still needed. And these areas included Sutherland, they included Strathleith, Assynt, Ross, Coiach, Ardmannach, Strathcarron, Lochaber, Lorne, Breadalbane, Argyll, Perth, Athol, Strathalmond, and Strathearn. And I'm hoping the slide will reappear. Thank you. Reappear only briefly. And at this point, another character properly joins our story, Robert Gordon of Strelloch. I'm just trying to go on to the next slide here. And if you could go on to the next slide, please. My pointer, there we are, thank you. Gordon had been educated in Aberdeen and Paris, and he was a scholar of some repute. A letter from Charles I in October 1641 shows that the king had been shown proofs of the engraved maps, and he again encouraged progress on the project, exempting Robert Gordon from his official duties. Robert Gordon's skills were probably more chorographic rather than cartographic, and he compiled several of the historical descriptions of Scotland, as well as regional descriptions for northern territories within the atlas. Now, the engraving and printing of the Pomp maps by Blaeu fundamentally transformed their original qualities. The variety, the complexity, the subtlety of Pont's original first-hand manuscript map that we can see here on the left for Dumfries was generalized and standardized into a Dutch aesthetic. Pont's untidy and crude original sketches were repackaged into one of the greatest publishing projects the world had ever seen. The sumptuous artistry and engraving of the Blaeu maps represent Scotland through the prism of the Dutch Golden Age. Pont's name lives on in the maps. We can read him down here beneath the title. But the stylized surveyor becomes a Dutch surveyor. Timothy Pont's austere and informative late 16th century Scottish landscape gets repackaged behind chubby cherubs and carousing couples. And we can see again that Blaeu all the time was interested in bulk, in publishing more maps in his atlases than his rival. Now, I have absolutely nothing against the small isles south of Skye, and realize that the few hundred people who collectively live there, they're the center of the world. But how else could Blaeu really justify devoting a whole page spread to them, with most of the page filled with empty sea? Blaeu needed better texts as well, and in August 1641, Sir John Scott made a petition to the General Assembly for a description of our shiredoms by some in every presbytery. By January 1642, the church had instructed its commissioners to prepare information on its parishes according to a written set of instructions, a precursor to the later statistical accounts. Some progress was initially made in Fife by the Presbytery of Kirkcaldy and in St Andrews. William Forbes of Innerwick, and we can see his name here in the printed Blaeu Atlas, also wrote on the Lothians. There was further sporadic work elsewhere, but thereafter support for the project waned. Although the General Assembly urged compliance a further 4 times between 1643 and 1649, there were many competing distractions with serious political disturbances and warfare. In 1644, the 20,000-strong Scottish army of the Covenant marched into England and played a decisive role in the Battle of Marston Moor. The engagement crisis of 1648, the execution of King Charles in 1649, focused clerical attentions elsewhere. And there were the military campaigns of the Marquis of Montrose as well. Blaeu's requests for material to complete the atlas became steadily more urgent. In August 1642, the General Assembly released Robert Gordon's son James, who was the minister of Rotherley parish, also in Aberdeenshire, from his ministerial duties to compile a new map of Fife, published in the atlas finally as Fifae Vice Comitatus. A letter from Scott to Robert Gordon, dated the 2nd of September 1645, praises James for in fact keeping a copy of the original map of Fife, as it had been stolen in transit to Aberdeen by pirates from Dunkirk. In October 1646, James had proceeded to Aberdeen to prepare a very detailed description and map of the town. He then proceeded swiftly to Edinburgh, where in 1647 the town council paid him £350 Scots for drawing his spectacular map of Edinburgh, a bird's eye view from the south that has remained famous to this day. But although both of these plans were complete by 1649, they were not engraved by Blaeu until much later, until the later 1650s for Edinburgh and 1661 for Aberdeen, and they never appeared in the atlas. In September 1645, Sir John Scott escaped the Civil War by visiting Amsterdam, and as he assisted Blaeu directly with the atlas. By 1645, Blaeu had published volume 4 of his Atlas Novus, which covered the counties of England and Wales. And he moved on to the town atlas of the Netherlands. But only 8 of the Scottish descriptions, the written texts, had been completed by this time. Fortunately for Blaeu, Scott passed whole days in my establishment, writing, dictating what made for illustrating the maps of the country with such felicity of memory that though lacking all papers and books, he dictated regional shapes, situations, boundaries, old and more recent lords, the produce of the soil, cities, rivers, and similar matters in great profusion. Robert Gordon was given further parliamentary exemptions from his official duties in 1646 and 1649. Yet Blaeu had continual reason to seek more than Gordon was able to deliver. Rather than send detailed regional maps of all the areas that Blaeu had listed in his letter that he wanted detailed regional maps for, Gordon fell back on the far less detailed overviews, including maps like this, Extrema Scotiae, and only 4 maps in the final atlas are actually credited to Robert Gordon. By March 1649, Blaeu informed Scott that he was ready to begin printing Scotland, and he intended to finish it that year if only the descriptions were supplied. And Blaeu never also received dedicatory coats of arms that repeatedly he'd requested in his letters. As a result, many of the final maps were published, as we see here, with blank dedicatory panels. Amongst the final material to be compiled were Robert Gordon's Scotia and Siqua map, a map showing and historical names of places, which was unfortunately, yet further events then conspired against Blaeu, and for a period of 5 long years, from 1649, progress on the atlas was largely halted. First of all, the execution of the king in January 1649, and the new Cromwellian administration deprived the royalist Sir John Scott of his official posts. And then secondly, by 1652, a war broke out between England and the United Provinces for the next 2 years, which sabotaged trade and communications. However, even before peace was declared in April 1654, Blaeu was in contact with Commonwealth forces in Scotland, and a 14-year license was granted by Cromwell, and we can read that here on this right-hand side, for publication of the Atlas. Blaeu also received copyright licenses from the States General in the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire, all of which were printed in the first edition, securing comprehensive copyright for him. With some justification, Robert Gordon could write in the prefatory pages of the Atlas, "Now at last, after many labours endured, the loss of much time, and troubles such as the mind shudders to recall, our Scotland is put on view." Now, what we call the Atlas of Scotland is in fact the 5th volume of Blaeu's Atlas Novus, Pars Quinta, as we can read here down to the lower left. The arms of Scotland are supported here on classical columns, and it allowed this central panel to take titles in different languages. In his introductory materials, Blaeu recognizes the key roles played by Robert Gordon, who is described as being so taken up with his chorographical and map work that the man seemed to me to be Scotland in himself. And Sir John Scott of Scots is praised too, the contractor and tutor of Pont and Gordon's maps. Pont's original text also formed the basis for some of Robert Gordon's written texts. And for all the reasons we've seen, some regions are poorly covered. In the case of Lauderdale, we're told why. The area's description was promised by Lord John, Earl of Lauderdale, but he was captured at the Battle of Worcester in the Civil War. As Blaeu writes, "Enjoy these, reader, until he has been restored, or some other has provided better." In fact, the Earl of Lauderdale was imprisoned in England right through to the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. For Knapdale too, more doubtless could be said about this province, says Blaeu, which the harshness of the times prevents. Evidence of political affairs undermined attempts at national geographic descriptions. For some regions, the Atlas is important in collating descriptions from different authors at different dates. And the result is a thick description in which we learn something not just of what Scotland's geography looked like in the mid-17th century, but how historians worked in building on one another's works. Occasionally, phrases capture the imagination. For John McClellan, a Newtonard schoolmaster and Kirkcudbright minister, the whole of Galloway has the shape of an elephant. The head is the rins, the trunk is the mole, the feet the promontories stretching into the sea, the shoulders the mountains mentioned above, the spine of the back the rocks and moors, and the rest of the body the rest of the region. And of the Orkney island of Wales, we are told by Walter Stewart, the Minister of South Walsay, its south coast is gnawed at as if by a rabid dog by the Pictish Strait. Its waves, like so many teeth, are strongly resisted by the very high and hard cliffs which stretch out before this island and blunt the bite. But as Blaeu failed to obtain his descriptions for so many areas, he was forced to fall back for many areas on William Camden, who we see referenced here. And a feature of Camden's descriptions is the poetic description of places. Most of this is in fact from the work of two Aberdeenshire poets, John Johnston and his namesake Arthur Johnston. Epigrams on towns, their intrinsic beauty, their historical significance, notable natives and so on were very common in chorography. And we're given by the Johnstons verse descriptions of Aberdeen, Ayr, Cupar, Dumfries, Dundee, Forfar, Glasgow, Perth, St Andrews and Stirling. It's not appropriate to judge Blaeu's maps by the later languages of scientific accuracy or compare the text to modern-day travel guides. We should see the maps and text in Blaeu's atlas not as antiquated views or accounts of a Scotland long ago, but on their own terms, as up-to-date and lively visions of the nation, depicting the nation by illustrating and describing its places. Editions of the atlas with Dutch, French and German text swiftly followed the Latin edition during 1654. And significantly, there was no English language edition of the atlas. Blaeu presumably considered the market to be too small. In March 1656, Scott sent Robert Gordon's detailed description of Aberdeen and Banff to Blaeu, which appeared in copies of the Spanish edition from 1659, but not in the Latin, not in Latin until 1662. The text was reset for the second Latin edition, but the only other plate changes were the addition of compass roses and ships on 28 map plates where they were originally lacking, as we can see comparing the 1654 map of the Uist with the 1662 to the lower right. And meanwhile, of course, Blaeu continued to battle away with his rival, new volumes for other countries rapidly following in the later 1650s. Eventually, by the 1660s, Blaeu finally beat him through the publication of his incredible Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, or Atlas Major, the Grand Atlas. This had over 3,000 text pages, 12 volumes, and nearly 600 maps, and it was the most expensive book that money could buy at the time. Nothing like it had ever been published before. But if Blaeu took any satisfaction from finally beating his rival, it was short-lived, as in 1664, Jansonius died, bringing an abrupt end to their 30-year World Atlas spat. For Blaeu, really nothing mattered more than the sales figures. He recognized that the wealthy patrons who could buy such atlases were interested in its presentational value as a status symbol. Aesthetic considerations such as sumptuous bindings, fine engraving, bright color, and beautiful typography were emphasized. Some of the finest copies of the Atlas Major survive today, as we've seen, in specially carved cases of walnut or mahogany. Now, the maps often presented old information. Many of them, as for Scotland, had been drafted over half a century earlier. An inconsistent geographic spread across the whole known world. There was really no defining intellectual principle to Blaeu's Atlas Major, but in its sheer bulk and its beautiful maps, it was awesome. Blaeu's printing presses became the largest in the world at the time, impressive industrial-scale operations described in glowing terms by visitors from far and wide. His main older press was located on Blaeu Atlas in Amsterdam, with 9 presses for books and 6 presses for maps, employing perhaps over 80 men working full-time. And in 1667, a second press was acquired at Gravenstraat, where most of the map plates were probably printed. It's estimated that 650 copies of the Blaeu Atlas were printed with text in Latin, 400 in French, and 300 in Dutch, 200 in Spanish. Really small print runs by comparison with later Atlas publishing. But collectively, it's a massive operation, the equivalent to printing 950,000 map pages and 5.4 million text pages just for one work. Quite a staggering achievement, even when spread over several years. Jan Blaeu's career mirrored the success of his map publishing. From 1651 to 1672, he served on the Amsterdam City Council without a break, holding several public offices. Along with many of his contemporaries, Blaeu used his wealth to invest in Dutch colonial interests in North America, and he owned sugar plantations on the Virgin Isles. He had married in 1634. By the 1660s, had 3 sons and 3 daughters, but disaster was about to strike. In February 1672, a fire broke out in the main printing press at Gravenstraat. There are conflicting accounts of the episode, but it's clear the damage was enormous, destroying not only thousands of paper sheets and printed maps, but also metal for type and copper plates, which stacked in the corners, I'm quoting here, melted like lead in the flames. Although his other press at Blaeu limped along, it was a painful and bitter blow for Blaeu. The disaster was made even worse by Blaeu's fall from political office under the new regime of William III, William of Orange, later in that year. Many of his surviving copper plates were soon sold, and in December 1673, Blaeu died, leaving his 22-year-old son in control of the company. The Blaeu Press continued to publish maps and other works, but its heyday was over, and the firm ceased operations in the early years of the 17th century. So what can we say by way of conclusion? Looking at our leading cast of Pont, Scott, Gordon and Blaeu, they all ended their days in disappointment and sometimes worse, economic and political ruin. Perhaps their lives illustrate the folly of worldly ambition and success. The story of the Atlas illustrates too the fundamental importance of economics and politics behind map and book publishing, thwarting it in Scotland, allowing it only through Blaeu's magnificent creation, but even then interrupted by warfare and political turmoil. Pont could surely never have envisaged his work would be published 40 years after he died and look quite like it did. But the Atlas did get published, and what a stunningly beautiful thing it was and is, and with a very long afterlife too. Most maps of Scotland and her regions were based on it for the next century. The Pont maps and Blaeu letters are also important internationally in being the only country's maps in the Blaeu Atlas where we have the surviving source documents, the source maps, and can trace Blaeu's working methods. Blaeu's Atlas of Scotland stands not just as a monument to Scotland's vision of itself, but also to how geographical knowledge was gathered and produced in 17th century Europe. Just to say, too, there are digitized versions of the entire Blaeu Atlas of Scotland, as well as Blaeu's Atlas Maya on our NLS Maps website. And there's a very detailed gazetteer of all the places on the maps, indexes of personal and place names in the text, and details supporting information. Don't forget, too, that you can view the real thing, the original Blaeu Atlas of Scotland, on display on the other side of the hall in our Treasures Gallery until March. But perhaps the final word, I think, should go to Blaeu, who in a very elegant and poetic sentence in the Atlas of Scotland itself begins by crediting Pont and Gordon as the map makers, but then goes on to credit Sir John Scott, who through his efforts allowed the wonderful publication to survive for posterity. And he writes, "The world does not owe gratitude only to those who create books, unite maps to the art of geography, and fit sky to lands and lands to sky as with the plumb line, but also to those who encourage, urge on, correct and increase these works, promote them with money and expense, strengthen what is feeble, recover what is lost, and give shape and polish to what is deformed, so that the illustrious offspring can be born and reborn and advance with beauty into the light and before the faces of men. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much. And Emma, if you could put me down just a little bit, that'd be fab. Thank you all so much for putting up. The people at home didn't realise what was happening on the screen here with things going blank. So thank you for looking up at us, and we had no idea what was going on, but luckily we've got there. We can have the Blaeu Atlas looking fantastic. When it goes blank on the screen, it doesn't look that good, does it? But we've got there. And thank you, Chris, for remaining very calm under all that stress and pressure. We've got some time just now for any questions in the room, but also my colleague Emma is at the back if there's any questions coming from online. So anybody in the room? We'll take this one first, and then I'll go to Emma at the back. Yes, sir.
I take it the collection here in the National Library is of all 12 volumes?
Yes, we have the Atlas Major in Latin, the 12-volume Atlas Major.
Is it all in the same language? Is it one set, or have you cherry-picked from...
No, it's all in one language, so it is the complete Latin edition, but we don't have other language editions of the Atlas Major. It's just that single Latin edition, and it was on exhibition about 10 years ago in our You Are Here map displays. It's a wonderful thing to see, and if you wanted to view it in reality, then you can visit our maps reading room, and we'd be happy to show it there.
Thanks, Chris. And Emma, have we got... We don't. Do we have a question here? Sir.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how the maps were actually created. Did somebody sort of walk along a river bank, number of steps they took, and a compass back and forwards, and how did they actually do it? It's extraordinary.
It's a really good question, and we have a number of question marks over Ponce's methods, because really the surviving manuscript maps are the main evidence. What we do know is that he didn't establish a trigonometric framework like later map makers of wider areas would do, or map makers of very detailed areas. And a trigonometric framework would have allowed him to measure one side of a triangle and then survey the angles to interconnected triangles. It was the best way of securing an accurate set of known positions and then surveying within those triangles. But Ponce didn't use those methods, and what we know from his written notes is he often proceeded along river valleys. His notes describe an itinerary that often mentions the places along a river valley with a farm here, a wood there, another tributary coming in from this side. And some of his working maps show just a single tributary along a river. And then we see others that seem to mesh some of these together. We find there are other maps, rather like the one I showed with Subtrahend in them, where he puts that dashed line between two tributaries from other areas where there's a note, right? Put these closer together, recognizing that the final version needed to mesh things more accurately. When we look at them now, it's clear that they couldn't be georeferenced accurately, but we know from looking at them that many of the places are broadly in a recognizable position. If you look at the map of the Lothians and spread outwards from Edinburgh, all of the place names are clearly identifiable and approximately where they ought to be, which was an essential part of the map making at the time and the chorographic method. But yeah, there's a lot of question marks over Ponce's methods, and in some ways we know more how he didn't do it rather than how he did.
If you can bear with me, Emma, we've got
a question from Patricia on the YouTube, who would like to know, the first maps included Ireland. Did the latter ones also? The later.
Sorry, Emma, could you just say that again?
So the first maps seem to include Ireland, but did the later maps also include Ireland?
Oh, yes, indeed. The Atlas of Scotland, what we call the Atlas of Scotland, the 5th volume of Blaeu's Atlas Novus, included 49 maps of Scotland and 6 of Ireland, and these were at the very end of the volume, and so much briefer coverage, but they had their own title page, and within the wider sequence for the Atlas Major, they continue to be published within the volume that includes the maps of Scotland. Yeah.
Any Are there questions in the room? Sir, bear with me 2 seconds.
Going back to Ponton, did he actually wander around Shetland, the Outer Hebrides and Orkney?
As far as we know, yes, because the map in Blaeu's Atlas of Orkney and Shetland, I showed a brief image of, is credited to Pont. And it does seem, on the basis of evidence, for the few maps that we know were compiled by Robert Gordon and James Gordon, they're clearly credited to Robert and James Gordon. So on the basis of the evidence of the Orkney and Shetland printed map, the answer is yes. We know that in 1592, he was commissioned to undertake a reconnaissance survey for minerals and metals in Orkney. So it's certainly true that he would have visited Orkney at that time. But as with so many other areas that Pont covered, there's no real surviving information on the ground to confirm when he might have been there or who he might have stayed with and how he did it. The only dated Pont map is one that covers Lanarkshire or Clydesdale, which has got 1596 written on it. And so, again, a lot of question marks over precisely when and how, but there's no one else who was around mapping Scotland at that time, and the credit to Pont on the printed map gives it quite good confirming evidence.
It's just a general question. It's obviously your speciality. When you look at the map of Africa, obviously the world, the contours weren't right. When did we get an accurate depiction of the map of the world?
Well, I think everyone's idea of accurate is quite open to debate, because in terms of geographic accuracy, things moved quite rapidly apace, but places like Australia, for example, or New Zealand were quite late discoveries that happened a lot later. There was a strong belief in a huge Antarctic continent, which, whilst correct at one level, was not anywhere near as huge as most. And the mapping of places like Antarctica was a lot later still. So you've got two factors, really: the geographic discovery of parts of the world, as well as much more accurate instrumentation, particularly the measurements of longitude effectively by accurate chronometers or timepieces in the 18th century allowed a lot of adjustments and corrections to the east-west extent of the maps of the world, even though latitudes had actually been mapped much more correctly for a longer period. But you could give I think you could give a whole evening lecture on that subject and still find the answer would be up to debate, because it's an ongoing process depending on what you look at and how you define, really, the word accuracy.
Chris, that's the next talk already put in place in the diary. We realise how popular this talk has been, both online and on site. We'll be sending a survey out after this, so please, both at home and here, take an opportunity to fill it in. Let us know what you think of this, what we're doing, everything. We really appreciate all your feedback on what we can do for you. So thank you all so much for coming out in such large numbers tonight. Thank you, everybody who's been watching via YouTube. We appreciate you doing that. I know we're in Canada, just for... So it's just brilliant that we can do this. Thanks to the team from Edinburgh College for everything that you do to get these images to people and then record it. You can watch it again tomorrow for Chris. But for now, thank you very much. And please join me in thanking Chris Lee.